Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the show. Today, I want to talk about communication and specifically what I learned about communication whilst studying Spanish. So, since I was 10, I was studying Spanish. I studied at school and I did it at university. I lived out there, and obviously, I learnt a lot. But one of the major things I learnt is what I like to call the triangle of communication. So, when I was at school and I was doing my GCSEs, which are the exams that you take when you're 16, my teacher would always talk about communicating ideas and how many ideas we were able to successfully communicate whenever we were taking exams, speaking exams, etc. And I always found this quite interesting because the measure of success in the exam wasn't so much to do with using amazing vocabulary or using really complex sentence structures. It was all to do with the communication of ideas, really. That was the major priority. Obviously, we all love to throw in a little imperfect subjunctive when we were 16. If you know, you know. But really, it's all about communicating ideas. And it's the same thing when it comes to communicating in general, whether we're translating from Spanish or whether we're just communicating an idea through a leaflet or whatever it might be. This podcast as well, I've had some feedback recently that sometimes I can just really go around the houses when I'm trying to communicate an idea, and that is an example of poor communication. So what I mean by this triangle is, I'm going to use Spanish as the example here. Imagine you've got this triangle and the point is at the top. So it's like a 2D pyramid. And in the bottom left corner, you have English. In the bottom right corner, you have Spanish. And at the top of this pyramid, you have meaning. Now, to go from English to Spanish or from Spanish to English, you can't just go across the bottom there. You can't just go straight from English to Spanish or Spanish to English. You need to go via meaning. And when we say something in English, my default thing that I'd always use as an example when talking about this is if we say, might as well. Might as well doesn't really make any grammatical sense. But might as well, when we use it, usually we're saying, I might as well do that. I'll attempt it is another way of saying might as well, for example. Okay, so bear with me here. So really all we're trying to say is I'll attempt that. It's worth my effort right now. Or it's minimal effort, so sure, I'll do that, is really what we're trying to say if we're being grammatically correct. But we've attributed it to might as well. But the meaning, might as well, that doesn't have any intrinsic meaning, right? So if we're trying to translate might as well into Spanish, we can't just translate it literally. If you've learned any language, or if you've tried to learn a language, you'll understand that at least back in the day, obviously translators are getting more sophisticated now, but certainly back in the day, things like Google Translate, it did a terrible job because it would translate very literally, word for word, what your input is. And that is not how to speak a language fluently, right? So you can't go directly from English to Spanish, nor can you go directly from Spanish to English. It just doesn't work. You need to think about, okay, what is the actual meaning that I'm trying to get across, and how can I best translate that meaning in the language that I'm trying to speak in, right? Or how can I best get that meaning across so whoever's receiving the meaning understands it, right? That's the metaphor with English to Spanish. And I really hope that this makes sense. We're trying to communicate meaning, not very specific words. The priority is to have someone understand what's in our head. And it's one of the hardest things to do. It's also one of the hardest things to do, English to English. Okay? We spend a lot of time and companies spend a lot of money trying to convince people of ideas. That's essentially what marketing and PR and all of these different industries are. The best way to do that is you need to start with who you're trying to reach. You need to start with the receiver and then go from the receiver backwards. You need to go from the receiver, think about the meaning that you're trying to get the receiver to understand, and then think about how to best translate that meaning in the way that the receiver will receive it. You know, if And we all know this, like subtly, somewhere in the back of our minds, we all know this. But I think there's a level of entitlement with assuming that people will receive what we're trying to say as we want to say it. There's no empathy. We don't empathize with our audience as much. We're trying to show off language, or we're trying to show off our own understanding of something. But that's not communication. Communication needs to start with whoever's listening, and you need to speak at their level and in their language. So I mentioned a book in a recent episode by Tom Albrighton called How to Write Clearly, and he talks about this. There's a level of empathy that we need to achieve with an audience before we can communicate effectively with them. And that means we need to understand how it is that they're approaching our content. We need to understand what kind of headspace they're in for them to best receive it. You know, you can come up with the most convincing argument ever. If the person opposite isn't ready to receive it, then it's not going to be received. It's as simple as that. I hope that with this podcast episode and with podcast episodes that has happened in the past, and with all of my content, that I'm speaking in a way that has a certain level of empathy for anyone listening or anyone consuming it, so that any messages that I'm trying to get across are well received. Does that make sense? So it's all about meaning. We need to stop going from English to Spanish. We need to stop cutting across the bottom of this triangle, and we need to make sure that we go via meaning, which starts with the receiver. And how can we get our message, how can we communicate our information in the best way for the receiver to receive it? Just something to think about as we go about our week. Happy Monday. Thank you very much for listening. Please make sure you like, subscribe, follow, and all the rest of it. And I will see you all on the next one.